The Zelda Indigo Romhack is a must-play. The work of a developer that goes by Kenton M., this working title Romhack is a high-quality fun time that ranks up there with some of the best Ocarina of Time mods, even in its current demo form. While there is still plenty in progress, Kenton has put together an experience that rivals the short-form ROM hacks like Dawn and Dusk and The Missing Link. Similar to Dark Hyrule Fantasy, there are signposts, obstacles, or NPCs at various points where development is still ongoing. But Kenton has gone above and beyond to tease the overworld locations, my personal favorites being Subrosia and Lina City from the Oracle games. Kenton's YouTube channel also has some developer updates that show off a mixture of testing and actual implemented elements like new textures, environments, enemies, and items, and he even streams some of his demonstrations and testing sessions. Transparency like this from developers isn't always something we see in these projects, so I sincerely hope everyone can pass along the encouragement he needs to keep this going. To build something like this without compensation is a true sacrifice of time and a total commitment of willpower. And as a fan base of either Zelda or the N64 in general, we should be so grateful that we have fans so committed as this. There are of course staple community developers like Zell, Kaze, Captain CDI, Luigi Blood, Spire, Melon Speedrun, CDI Fails, and so on. But I just want to make sure Kenton gets due credit for taking on such a huge project. Now I'm going to talk through my thoughts on everything I played through in the demo, so beware of spoilers here if you haven't played the demo yourself. Some of these will get a bit more attention later in the video, but I want to briefly talk through all the mechanical changes and improvements I noticed in this demo compared to the original Ocarina of Time. The C button inventory has now been doubled with the use of the down button on the D-pad. You have 2 pages of C button inventory to utilize. This significantly reduces the number of pauses and visits to the select item subscreen. On top of that, any boot items are now also applied via C buttons instead of the equipment subscreen. This is in keeping with the improvement made in the Wind Waker, which was carried through Twilight Princess and Ocarina 3D. You don't start with a sword and instead must survive using Deku sticks until you get the Kokiri sword. There's basically an infinite supply of these via rolling into trees, but I think it's a good creative choice to force an item on the player that is commonly misunderstood as weak when it can in fact do more damage than the Kokiri sword. Adult Link can also carry the boomerang and the aforementioned sword, compared to those being young Link only items in the original. There are also new items that, while not necessarily new to 3D Zelda, are new to Ocarina of Time and the like, with the water bombs, remote bomb shoes, bomb arrows, and my favorite of the demo, the Rock's Feather. The Rock's Feather is such an important part of 2D Zelda, and I'm really excited to see all the ways it can get put to use here. Another staple of Ocarina also making a return would be the warp songs. The demo starts you off on a snowy mountaintop that has obvious Snowhead influences, and I love that. There are a few signs with messages from the developer to help get you started. There are a few branching paths here, but you'll ultimately only be able to go one way, and that takes you back to the overworld hub. The overworld seems to be titled The Scar, and I'm not sure if that's something that is a reference to or has relevance in another Zelda game, but not that I'm aware of, and for all I know it could be a working title as well. You can walk around the rim of the overworld finding various entrances to areas that will assumably end up being part of the completed product, and this really drives home the sense of anticipation I have to see what all is coming in the future, especially again with Lina City and Subrosia as I grew up playing the Oracle games on my Game Boy Color. Much like with exiting the mountain area, you'll eventually run out of places to attempt to enter, and that will lead you to Kokiri Forest. The atmosphere here, while still similar to the original, does almost achieve that sense of awe I had when playing The Missing Link for the first time. I just never get tired of seeing Kokiri Forest and or the Lost Woods rearranged into a new layout, even if it doesn't include new or reworked assets. The shop has a few big ticket items with the Deku Shield and the Boomerang, both of which are normally only used by young Link, so it's a change of pace to see these being used by adult Link. As far as whether these items will be placed here in the finished product could still be up in the air, as there are several items just placed throughout the demo to prevent progression gating from hindering the experience. The forest branches off into 3 areas: the maze, the Great Deku Tree dungeon, and lastly a reworked Gerudo training grounds. The maze is a bigger, slightly more complex take on the same location from Ocarina. At the end of it lies the Kokiri sword and an optional mini-boss fight with a flaming Stalfos of sorts. The interesting aspect of this, though, is those NPCs will interact with you differently based on how you handle this optional fight. If you choose to take out the Stalfos, which is the ghost of the Kokiri hero, you will be met with scorn and the prices of the shop will be impossible and some items even gone completely. I kept a save state prior to the fight and tested this out just to see how the NPCs would react to this, but I did not pursue it much after talking to a few, just to avert any risk of locking myself out of anything and having to start over. I haven't watched the developers' logs on YouTube out of the want to prevent any spoilers for myself, so there's a chance he comments on this somewhere, but I'm interested to see how or if this feature plays out in the finished product as far as any sort of branching paths or karma system. With how linear these games tend to be, it's hard to wrap my head around how this would work, and I would be perfectly happy if this didn't make it into the final product either way. This Great Deku Tree dungeon differs from the original in that it has already succumbed to its curse before you come across it, and it is much larger inside and out. Based on it being relatively straightforward, this dungeon definitely seems like it would be one of the first few dungeons. It still has a handful of dead-end scenarios, but it is ultimately the kind of dungeon where you can see multiple paths from the beginning of the level, but at any given point there really is only one door to progress through. More on that later. It is simple, but it has plenty of flavor to make it feel new and exciting, if anything, as a welcome spin on what was one of the most important dungeons in Zelda history. My favorite aspect of said flavor is the quick exterior shot at the top of the tree where you get the bow. It harkens back to the Spirit Temple or even Dragon Roo's Cavern. I'm always a sucker for quick trips outside that are still a part of the dungeon but allow a quick glimpse back out into the overworld. It's not necessarily anything new as far as Zelda goes, but I thought the giant Deku Baba was a cool encounter, and while I wish there could have been more variety with the final boss, I understand why there isn't. Building new content for the world and the dungeons is enough work, and creating new enemies and bosses is no exception. But I still think the slight palette swap Goma still looks very nice. Between this, Dark Hyrule Fantasy, and Dawn and Dusk, the purple and pink accents on enemies and environments are used to great effect in many of these ROM hacks. The last area in Kokiri is the Training Grounds Gauntlet, which is being used to provide the player with various items and weapons that will ultimately be placed elsewhere in the finished product. It also introduces new enemies as well as provides a demonstration of how some of these new items work. Here you will gain access to the Iron Boots, which, as I mentioned earlier, are now equipped via the C button versus the equipment subscreen. You also get access to new items with the Water Bombs, Remote Bomb Chews, and the Rock's Feather. The Water Bombs and Remote Bomb Chews function exactly how they sound, and the Rock's Feather functions the same as in its 2D predecessors. But the catch is, Ocarina already has the automatic context-sensitive jump, so this serves as a double jump, basically. There's also a very creepy surprise with the updated Redead, and this is pure nightmare fuel. The training grounds stand out in contrast against the Kokiri Forest environments and textures, so it's hard to say if this will be here long term or if it will ultimately be replaced by an additional area of the forest. It is ultimately a really fun time, and with the addition of a few more rooms, almost even worthy of being short-form content on its own. But most importantly, it gives you the warp song to our final destination, the Skyloft Ruins. This dungeon is definitely the crown jewel of the demo. I'm not the biggest fan of Skyward Sword, but I think anyone could sincerely appreciate this one. The Forest Temple music could very well be a placeholder, but I think it perfectly captures the aura of mystery that the Forest Temple instilled in us on our first visit. Who resided here? What was the purpose of this place? What happened to them? If you put this game in a vacuum of not having the prior experience or knowledge of Skyward Sword, this dungeon feels so much like the Forest Temple and echoes the same sentiments and questions, albeit in a much brighter atmosphere. Even with prior knowledge of Skyward Sword and Skyloft, this leaves so much to the imagination that you can still help but ask those questions and add to the mystery of the place. But with the heavy presence of ghostly enemies like Stall Children of all sizes, Stalfos, the new Stallchild Shaman, Bubbles, and the underappreciated Gomez as the boss, this dungeon still leaves you with the same question as the Forest Temple with its Stalfos, Bubbles, and Pose. Why and how did the residents meet their apparent terrible fate? I also think the similarities to the City in the Sky from Twilight Princess are unmistakable, but the environments, layout, and enemy placement here are a lot more intentional and less abstract, and that's why I lean more on the Forest Temple angle. This dungeon makes great use of most of the items you've received thus far, and it also introduces the bomb arrows. These aren't new in the grand scheme of Zelda, but they are new to Ocarina of Time gameplay. Maybe there's a mod or a hack out there that had these before, but this is the first I've seen them being used to this scale. The puzzles in this dungeon are very satisfying as well. I won't go into too much spoilers, but I want to discuss one type of puzzle specifically that feels very Oracle of Ages. I think the floor tiles puzzles here are a really fun time. The first one introduces the concept and isn't too tough, but the second one really makes you think before tackling it. You even get a high point in the room to map out your path, and there's a good laugh to be had up there that I won't spoil. I briefly mentioned the boss, but I want to say how underappreciated I think the bosses like Gomez and Death's Sword are in the Zelda series. While they are clearly reserved for some of the darkest and creepiest dungeons, they only appear once, and I'm very excited to see Gomez used here. Letting the bomb arrows fly while you hop around the battlefield dodging the fire hazard is an extremely satisfying battle. And I realized mentioning wanting a more original boss when I got to Queen Goma, but Gomez is just so underrated that I have to do an about face and give credit here for choosing it. Ultimately, I think it adds that much more mystery to just how Skyloft ended up like this. A Grim Reaper-like character in Stone Tower fits completely, as the dungeon theme revolves around themes of greed, death, punishment, and even hell. The Forest Temple and Skyloft Ruins still have a mystery of death surrounding them, but in more of a forgotten or lost souls theme versus the punishment and doom of places like Stone Tower and the Arbiter's Grounds. So to see what is basically the Grim Reaper of the Zelda series lying in wait at the end of the ruins of the origin of Hylian civilization was an excellent creative choice. Overall, I think the two dungeons really do set the bar high for the finished product. And if the Skyloft Ruins end up being the best dungeon out of the bunch, that will be perfectly fine with me because it is a very good dungeon. The Deku Tree is a straightforward good time that doesn't bite off more than it can chew, and like I said earlier, is an improved take on one of the most important Zelda dungeons ever made. What I appreciate about it is how nicely it all comes together. It is a tight, compact dungeon that only gives you one or two opportunities to take a wrong turn. And while that may sound too easy, I prefer this over the ruse of branching paths like Dodongo's Cavern, which briefly attempts to overwhelm you but quickly gets narrowed down to only a single path forward. I don't necessarily mean that I dislike Dodongo's Cavern. As a kid, that first room always had me excited with just how many doors there appeared to be, but as an adult, it almost feels lazy or cheap. Skyloft Ruins, on the other hand, had me taking multiple sittings and some backtracking here and there. The lack of a dungeon map may have had something to do with that, but I thoroughly enjoyed having to concentrate on navigating the dungeon. I would forget where the last locked door I came across was, or a puzzle that required the bomb arrows that I needed to backtrack to after obtaining them. It felt like classic adult Link Temple dungeon fare from Ocarina of Time. Skyloft has a brilliant central room mechanic as well. Not all dungeons in the series have these, but they are a common staple of 3D Zelda's dungeon design. Think of places like the Forest Temple, the Water Temple, the Ancient Cistern, and so on. The use of the central mechanic is obvious to the player at first, but arriving at the how is a lot of fun and a very satisfying part of progressing through the dungeon. This is a demo, and hopefully eventually a full game that deserves your attention, and the developer deserves your praise. I know a lot of people are talking about the Sealed Palace right now, and I hope to play that soon as well, but I just hope this doesn't get lost in the shuffle and overlooked. After all, there is no guarantee that the completed product will ever see the light of day, as this is a huge undertaking for a single person, and even with community support, it is really hard to see these through to completion as we have seen so many times.